Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. This is an educational channel. We try to let you know about great theories of everything, great discoveries, concepts, and anything that will help you to accentuate your mental, physical, spiritual life and your personal sovereignty, and mostly things that are suppressed, things that the powers that be don't want you to know. And if you are to know them, you need to do a great deal of digging. So hopefully this will, um, give you a little bit of a little bit of a hole to start with, so you don't have to dig so much to get all this stuff. And I try to be a little bit of a guide. A lot of this material is relatively difficult and requires a great deal of context to understand its significance. And so I'm trying to provide that without being overly editorial. And this is our 315th Bible Decode. We've been looking at mostly the New Testament and mostly at the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 until 96 AD. And those are Emperors Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they wrote the New Testament, according to the theory, for the purposes of psychological warfare against the Jews. The Jews had been a big thorn in the side of the entire Roman Empire for over a century, with their separatist religion, their xenophobic beliefs, and their unwillingness to assimilate to the Roman ways. They had all of their rituals and strictures, their jealous and zealous God who believed that they were the chosen people, and this made life difficult for the Romans. High maintenance, higher than any of the other subject peoples in the Roman Empire. And this culminated in the war from 66 until 73 AD between the Romans and the Jews. Emperor Vespasian at that time was one of the generals that fought in that war, as was his son Titus. When Emperor Vespasian became the new emperor in 69 AD, he left the military to his son Titus. And this is all documented in the 7-volume work War of the Jews by Josephus, Flavius Josephus, who was a court member and as well as an adopted family member of the Flavians, and wrote the history with great fanfare and the full endorsement of Emperor Titus, and implicitly by Emperor Vespasian. And so, I guess it's a little bit of mix of history and propaganda. But if you take a look at War of the Jews and kind of read it alongside your Gospels, especially the book of Luke, you will recognize myriad, or at least manifold, parallel themes, parallel constructions, and in many cases, puzzles that you need both of of the books in order to solve. More or less meaning that the two books were written by the same author or authors. Now, Josephus talks about in his autobiography his story. He was a Jew who fought in this war, but was captured by Vespasian and became a defector. He defected to the Romans. He believed that now God has shown me that God favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans, predicted that Vespasian would one day become the new emperor. And when that did happen, Vespasian pardoned Josephus and brought him to Rome, gave him a town house at Caesar's palace, made him the court historian, and adopted him as a member of his family. That to me is just a little bit too tall of a tale and a little bit too uncharacteristic of what the Romans actually did do with their captured military opponents. Now, this has all been dug into by people like Joseph Atwill, who shows that the 3-year ministry of Jesus in Judea is nothing but a parody on the 3-year military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Jesus goes, Titus goes, or put in the reverse, every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes. And they go to these places in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced in time by 40 years. The Gospels were written at the same time as War of the Jews, but then the Gospels are backdated by 40 years. So they're set 40 years before the time that they were written, or a little bit more than 40 years. And the history is set really at the time that it was said to have occurred. But the events are spaced out by 40 years, and there are over 40 such events, which is astronomically improbable for that to be happening by coincidence. And the 40-year thing also gives room for Jesus to make a lot of prophecies in the New Testament that actually come true in the pages of the War of the Jews, especially his prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem, and that the destruction of Jerusalem would be the sign of his second coming. The destruction of Jerusalem was overseen by General Titus, making General Titus the second coming of Jesus. It's written right into the script. The Romans were usurping the religion of the Jews and replacing themselves as the, the messiahs or the titular heads of the religion there, by inserting Titus as the second coming of Jesus. And this was well recognized throughout history up until the 19th century. Even theologians recognized that Titus was the second coming of Jesus. It's only been a recent phenomenon that, I won't say a recent phenomenon, but it's never been unanimous among theologians. But it was a commonplace point of view among theologians that Titus was the second coming of Jesus, and that the book of Revelation had already occurred. But there are many, many, many more parallels that are discussed by Michael Menescatz. He found 250 parallels just in the book of Luke, and he graphed those parallels out on a chart, um, plotting a point, putting a dot on the chart every place there was a parallel, and found that those dots all put together form 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, which was the emerging language of the Roman Caesars. They all spoke Greek, and most of them spoke Latin as well. So that, and the fact that the Gospels and Josephus also are in Greek, these are all red flags that you Christians should be able to recognize are very shaky, uh, very shaky points within the New Testament. Now, we are looking at another one of these authors who also talks about the Roman origins hypothesis from a slightly different angle, and a more controversial angle. Probably Joseph Atwill is quite dismissive of this approach from a character named Roman Piso. I don't know if that's his real name, but he claims to be a descendant of the powerful Piso family of Rome from this time period. And they were known as the Little Caesars. And they kind of had a little bit of a rivalry with the Julian Caesars, the ones of Julius Caesar and Augustus, all the way up until Nero. And there were many assassinations and scandals between the two during that century of that rivalry. Now, one of the Pisos is named Arius Piso, who actually does not even appear in the historical record, but through a lot of clues and detective work, both Roman Piso and independently Abelard Reuchlin have determined that Josephus is the true author of the New Testament, but that Josephus was just a pen name for Arius Piso. And Arius Piso is the true author of the Gospels, and the rest of his family is responsible for the rest of the New Testament in installments over the course of the next 50 years, all the way up until almost 135, 140 AD, when the book of Hebrews was written, and also the book of Revelation. This goes against a lot of the chronology from scholars who, for instance, believe that the Pauline epistles were written before the Gospels, strictly because Paul had the opportunity to refer to the Gospels in many cases to bolster his arguments, but did not. And so they assumed that Paul didn't have access to the Gospels because they hadn't been written yet. But according to Piso and Reuchlin, the Pauline epistles were written much later in the time period between 100 and 110 AD, and they were primarily written by Piso's younger foster brother, who is known as Pliny the Younger, these Gospels were written as plays, and Piso wrote himself in as the star. He played Jesus, but he also played Satan, who was also an invention of the Romans. The Satan in the Old Testament is not a supernatural Satan. It is always referring to a person, so the Satan is also a fraud, and the supernatural Satan is a fraud, primarily from Hollywood, really. I mean, it comes from the New Testament to start with, but it really gets blown up in the 20th century and just over time. And then He also writes himself in as God, and then after the crucifixion, he writes himself in as Peter, who becomes the first pope or first bishop of Rome, and so the head of the church. And he writes his children in as some of the disciples, and Pliny the Younger is written in as Paul. And they perform these plays in barnstorming tours around the countryside in front of the illiterate masses, including Jews and slaves and soldiers, according to Piso's work. Now we're just going over a lot of his different articles. He has a couple hundred of them out there that talk about different aspects of this. A lot of them are genealogies. He really contends his main points are that there is a mistaken identity, I guess, for a lot of the ancient literature that's out there. He claims that 100% of the ancient literature out there was written by royals, people, family members of the king or the Caesar or the Pharaoh, and that they used a lot of different pen names or aliases to make it seem like there was a lot more authors than there really were, and that the royals wrote for royals and did that in what he calls the royal language. They used a lot of misdirection and deception in their writing. It wrote in a kind of a coded language, flipping around certain consonants, using a lot of switching languages from one to another at times, using puns and code words, so that the royals would understand what was being said, but that the commoners would not. And the commoners would be steered off the track, while the royals could understand what was going on and laugh about it in their court, and laugh about the stupid masses, being hoodwinked by the newest propaganda piece that passed for scholarship of one kind or another, whether it's religion or politics or science or math or astronomy. All of it was represented by the royals as under pseudonyms. And Arius Piso was probably the main offender. He wrote under dozens of separate pseudonyms, according to Roman Piso, and that's how he pieced all this together by looking at a lot of the royal letters written between these different royals, especially a lot of the letters written by Pliny the Younger, as well as letters written by Tacitus, letters and books written by Tacitus, as well as Trajan, Emperor Trajan, corresponded a lot with Tacitus, and other Roman royals wrote amongst each other, and they would kind of leave breadcrumbs and clues behind that if you read all of it, you could kind of piece it together. The main evidence that I see that is most convincing for me is that both Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso came to the same conclusions independently of each other. And they both resurrected this character, Arius Piso, from nothing and claimed that he was the true author of the Gospels. So, otherwise, I don't read Latin, or I've taken a few years of Latin, but my Latin isn't good, and my Greek is non-existent, and so is my Hebrew. So I can't really judge this on the same level that they're coming from, but I think that it's worth presenting. So now he also mentions that the church fathers, all the early church fathers, from Saint Ignatius to Justin Martyr to Marcion to Irenaeus to Tertullian, all the way up to even Jerome and Augustine in the 5th century, that they're all um, written by the Piso family. This was kind of like their family business. They all were involved in writing as various um, fake names in order to forward this agenda of getting this religion off the ground, which it really didn't for a couple hundred years. And most of the writings of the church fathers was in order to um, pretend as if there was a big movement happening and that there were a lot at stake and people's passions were high and there was a lot of controversy. So here he's talking about Irenaeus, mid-second century guy, his book Against Heresies. He deliberately, again, misspells Christos, this time as Christos, when referring to Jesus, putting an E in there after the R. That is because, remember, while writing as Suetonius, he misspelled Christ in the same way. So now Emperor Emperor Antonius Pius also was Suetonius. He wrote as Suetonius. He was also Pope Pius the First, and his full name was Titus Aurelius Fulvius Bionius Arius Antoninus Pius, the grandson of Arius Piso, and ruled Rome from, I think I said 137, it's actually 138 until 161. Tertullian was Emperor Septimus Severus, and that was early 3rd century. He wrote something called Against Marcion. Marcion was a mid-2nd century guy who wrote the Gospel of Marcion, which is very, very, very similar to the Gospel of Luke, and is contended by some to be the first gospel, at least to be discovered. During the Roman Republic, 2 representatives were chosen from different Roman tribes or Roman royal lines to represent the Republic as figureheads. But then, after Julius Caesar became dictator, which I think was about 48 BC, maybe a little bit earlier, a change took place to create yet another illusion. The Claudio-Julian line of emperors became the dynastic rulers of the Roman Empire. Without letting the public know, 2 figureheads were still there, one public and one private, known only to the royals. That is, there was a secret co-emperor, which also co-ruled. And Arius Piso was the co-emperor when the Flavians were in there under Vespasian and Titus. And sometimes Arius Piso would go under the name of Titus. This is a form of ancestor worship. If they had these famous people as one of their ancestors, they could use their name. And so that becomes confusing because Arius Piso uses the name of Titus. And so when somebody like Joseph Atwill says that, Titus is the second coming of Jesus, Roman Piso is really saying that, well, Titus is the second coming of Jesus, but Titus was really Arius Piso, not Emperor Titus. Also, another one of Arius Piso's names was Optimus, and he used alias names of his that were the same as those emperors, such as Titus and Trajan, also. Trajan and Arius Piso died around the same time, 117, 118 AD. He's got an article here called Origen, Eusebius, Constantine, and Jerome. The mention of Christ and the works of Josephus was a later addition by Christians. Now that's what many scholars, especially skeptical scholars, believe, that Josephus is known as being the first non-biblical corroborator of the existence of Jesus. Writing in the 90s, in his 20-volume work, Antiquities of the Jews. He has a paragraph in there about Jesus, but this paragraph is kind of a non sequitur. It's like the paragraph before it and the paragraph after it don't really match up with the paragraph about Jesus, as if it were just inserted or interpolated into the text. Both Roman Piso, however, and Joseph Atwill would strongly disagree with that. And Joseph Atwill has a whole chapter, or at least a section of a chapter, in I think his book Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, about how they call it the Testimonium Flavianum. That's that paragraph that talks about Jesus, which is the only reference to him in this whole 20-volume work. But that it does actually fit in with those other two paragraphs if you know the code. The idea is this Decius. There was a Roman hero that was called Decius Mus, which was like a Roman soldier who sacrificed himself for the greater good. And then this Jesus character takes on that role, but is called Decius Mundus, which means that it's not just a sacrifice for the Romans, but a sacrifice for the whole world. And so Atwill works that over, and Arius Piso, or Roman Piso, also disagrees with the idea that this testimonium was an interpolation and just stuck in there by later scholars, possibly by Eusebius, who was a partner of Constantine, or possibly was Constantine, and was a church father writing in the early 4th century. So he says the prime suspects for having added the mention of Christ to Josephus were actually all related to each other. Tacitus's son, known in history as Pedanius Fuscus Salinator, who plays a big role in Josephus and is also highlighted by Joseph Atwill, as he was one of the founders of botany and one of the founders of homeopathy. And that is really a lot of the imagery that's involved in this entire scheme comes from the idea of homeopathy and botany, that the Romans were pruning the Jews, and then, as I said, I can't remember the word, but they are grafting themselves onto the Jewish religion. It's like they're really diverting the Jewish religion into the Roman religion. So they're grafting themselves in. So they use this character Pedanius as that vehicle in Josephus. Now, he was married to Julius Piso's daughter. Julius Piso was the author of Revelation, and he was not really on the game. He understood the game, but he was against his father and the rest of his family and what they were doing with this religion, with this psychological operation. And he wrote Revelation as a reveal of what actually was the agenda. And so his daughter was married to Pedanius, Julia, her name, and let's see. Also, Julius Piso was married to Emperor Hadrian's sister, and Hadrian was the ruler there from 117 to 138 AD. He says hardline rulers wanted to promote certain things that they wanted to remain in place. So this was all part of the agenda, the psychological operation known as the New Testament against the Jews, to remain in place: slavery, ignorance, superstition of the masses. These are all things that are promoted by Jesus and or Paul. Paul justifies slavery in a number of different places, and Jesus does it to a lesser extent. you know, obey your masters, and even just that, you know, God has appointed these people to be over you. Um, so they wanted to keep the form of government which allowed the royals to maintain their powerful positions. That is, they wanted this new religion to be and to reinforce everything that was the opposite of what he says that the Pharisees were promoting and fighting for. Now, um, he uses a lot of the Talmud to justify this. To me, it seems as if the Pharisees were kind of in the same boat here and under the same psychological operation, because a character very similar to Josephus named Yohanan ben Zakkai was one of the leaders of the Pharisees that basically surrendered to Vespasian as well, or maybe to Titus, and then predicted that he would one day become emperor. And he was rewarded with a land grant from the Romans um, to found a campus in at Jaffna in order to study endlessly the Torah and the other Jewish scriptures, and that led to what is called the Talmud and rabbinical Judaism. And so that was also sponsored by the Flavians. Now he says that they pretended like they were doing that, but while they were writing the Talmud, they encoded a lot of subversive ideas that went against what the Romans wanted. But they had to hide it, and they were eyewitnesses to the creation of Christianity, and so they discussed that in many parts of the Jerusalem Talmud as well. Um, I haven't read the Talmud enough to understand that to the extent that I would need to be able to judge that whether that's true or not. But he says the split within Judaism was not a simple disagreement; it had been an actual war, one that was hidden from history. Um, Basically, religious zealots and the other things, painting them as the bad guys, even as robbers. So there was some propaganda involved. But basically, between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, there was a civil war going on. The Pharisees wanted to get rid of slavery. They wanted basic human rights and even some type of democratic ideas, according to Roman Piso.